And as I say, there now needs to be a collective will across government and industry to make sure there is as much economic value from this as possible.
The world's largest offshore floating wind farm is to be built off northeast Scotland. Consent has been granted for the £3 billion Greenvolt project to move forward. Lord Aberdein of Aberdein, as your name has become since last week's podcast episode, good news for the northeast. And also, I suppose there's encouragement in here, isn't there? That look at this. This Scottish government can approve things when it comes to renewable energy.
Yeah, indeed, and I think, I've been the first to be quite critical of the Scottish Government, indeed all political parties, about energy policy, and I think we should pay tribute to them for getting the consent for this INTOG project, which is the targeted oil and gas project. So basically, this, along with 5 other projects, were approved on Friday, or yesterday, confirmed yesterday, I should say, and this is to try and decarbonise existing oil and gas platforms. But one of the projects, the biggest one out of those, is Greenvolt, as you mentioned, and that will be the first commercial-scale floating wind farm in Europe. It will be the world's largest floating wind farm in its entirety, and this is really positive news. Now, there's a hell of a lot of work to be done to ensure that there's Scottish supply chain content, Scottish jobs responsible for taking these developments forward. I thought it was really promising in the media interviews that Nicol Stephen, former Liberal Democrat leader but chief executive of Flotation Energies taking forward this project, made a point of saying, we are going to use local supply chain content in and around the northeast because of that skills and experience. It's an argument I've been making for a long time. You've got that subsea engineering capability there, so use it, and hopefully there will be jobs spun off of this and opportunities for investment as well. But the biggest point is that last point that I've just made. It's an indication to the marketplace that this is where world firsts are taking place. You can come here and invest in the certainty that there are projects being approved. And as I say, there now needs to be a collective will across government and industry to make sure there is as much economic value from this as possible for Scotland. If I may just finish the point by saying there was disappointing news as well for Berwick Bank, however. Now that's a fixed wind project, much larger in scale to Green Volt, and my understanding is from reading the press reports it's something to do with some environmental concerns. Now that's not to say that consent will not be given for this project. I fully expect it to be, but there's going to have to be some modifications, I believe, to the process to take into account those environmental concerns as well. So hopefully we can get that off the ground, and if we were having this conversation in a year, we'll have a series more pioneering projects taken forward and can really get going with the green industrialisation of our country.
Yeah. And Andy, that then brings me on to a story that has set all sorts of questions running and will be the theme really of this podcast ultimately, that the Scottish Government has ditched its flagship target of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 75% by 2030, accepting that it is now out of reach. There is an unwavering commitment, that's the quote, unwavering commitment to achieve net zero by 2045. That will remain. Mary Macdonald gave this update. She's Minister for Wellbeing, Economy, Net Zero and Energy. This was last Thursday at Holyrood. And it follows the Climate Change Committee, which said last month that 2030 target was now, quote, beyond what is credible. Now, as we say, that we're going to get on to what all of this kind of has meant politically in the fallout. But what do you make, first of all, Andy, of the ditching of the target?
Well, there is a sense of inevitability about the ditching of that target. I think we got a bit of a preview of that by Chris Stark from the Climate Change Committee a few weeks ago, who had effectively said it was going to be missed at that point. We saw yesterday that in order to meet the target of 2030, all internal combustion transport would have to be pulled off the roads with immediate effect. So, there's no point in holding on to that target being achievable. I think there's a couple of issues. One issue is picking targets out of the air, which I think there has been a propensity to do, especially when those targets are earlier than the equivalent targets at Westminster. There has been a propensity to say our target is going to be this, which is X years quicker than the awful government at Westminster. And politically, in the short term, those headlines might work quite well, but usually in the long term, they come back to bite you, which is what they've done just now as well. And I think the other thing, the more important thing than that, is that if you're going to set targets like that, then you've got to be pragmatic about how those targets are going to be reached. We are in quite a unique position in Scotland, in that we have a historic dependence over the last few decades on fossil fuels, not only for our energy, but for our economy and for our employment. And so you can't have a one-size-fits-all policy about how to get to net zero when you start with a pretty heavy dependence on fossil fuels and oil and gas, and when reaching net zero very quickly would inevitably involve cutting those off. And you also have to take difficult decisions that you might not want to take on how to actually get there quickly. So if you want, for example, we've talked about this on the podcast a lot, so I'll not dwell on it, but if you want to get very quickly to renewables, you have to make sure that you absolutely exploit the profits and the people of oil and gas to get there quickly, and we haven't done that sufficiently. On electric vehicles, which is one of the biggest things as well, and I've talked and written about this quite extensively, again, you've got to make sensible decisions about how you want to accelerate the transition to electric vehicles. And I don't really think that any of the very difficult parts of those decision-making processes have been done, because they quite often involve doing things which seem counterintuitive, like investing in current oil and gas fields, for instance, which might not always seem like the right thing to do. So I think Scotland can get there. I think clearly that's the backbone of Scotland's future economy, is to get there. But I'm not sure we're doing that in the right way at the moment, and I'm not sure we have the readiness to make those more difficult, pragmatic decisions to get there.
Thank you so much for watching. Press subscribe and you'll get all the best videos offering insight on Scottish politics delivered straight to your feed. Press subscribe and stick around. And if you'd like to hear our conversations in full, open up your podcast app and search for Holyrood Sources.